In a quiet American suburb, grief weighed heavy on Eleanor's shoulders. She had lost the love of her life, her husband, a decorated war veteran, and with him, the warmth of laughter and purpose. But just when silence threatened to consume her, a golden retriever named Apollo entered her life. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He simply wrapped his arms, yes, arms, around strangers as if mending broken hearts one hug at a time. What she would soon learn is that Apollo's silence held the loudest truth of all. Chapter 1. The Silence in the House. The clock in Eleanor's living room ticked loudest at night, not because it was broken or because its hands moved any faster than they should, but because the rest of the house had fallen unbearably quiet. She sat in her worn armchair by the window, knitting without purpose. The TV murmured in the background, some black and white movie George would have loved, but she wasn't really watching. She just needed noise. Anything to drown out the stillness that had swallowed her home since George died. He had been gone for 11 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Lung cancer had taken him swiftly, the kind that creeps in after years of perfect health. He was a proud veteran, chest once adorned with medals from his time in Vietnam. Even in his final days, he wore strength like a uniform. Eleanor, now 68, still set out his coffee mug every morning, still kept his favorite blanket folded neatly at the edge of the couch, still whispered "good night" to his photograph on the mantel. Sometimes she'd pull out the box, the one with his old letters, yellowed with time, ink faded but legible. They were written during his tours overseas. She knew many of them by heart, especially the one he wrote after the birth of their daughter, who had since moved far away to raise her own family in Oregon. She opened that letter now. "My darling Ellie, if you're holding this letter, it means I'm far from home. Again. But I want you to know that every moment I spend in this dusty uniform is for you. I dream of your laugh, of that silly way you burn toast, and of one day growing old together, porch swings and quiet mornings. And if I'm not there when that day comes, promise me this: you'll still find joy. You'll still let your heart feel. You'll live even without me. I love you more than the stars. George." Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, eyes welling. She had promised. But some days it was hard to keep that promise. The neighborhood had changed too. Kids who once played on sidewalks were now grown and gone. New neighbors moved in, but they stayed behind their own fences, their own griefs. No one really talked anymore. The world had become a quieter place, and not in the peaceful way. One afternoon, Eleanor walked past a community notice board near the park. A small flyer caught her eye. "Quiet, gentle golden retriever seeks a calm home. Doesn't bark. Special needs. Needs love." She stared at it. No barking? That was strange. She tore off the number and tucked it into her coat pocket. That evening, the silence felt heavier than usual. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, staring at 2 plates in the drying rack, hers and one she couldn't bring herself to put away. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, then looked over at the photo of George again. "I think I'm going to call about that dog tomorrow," she said softly. As if answering her, the clock ticked once, then twice, in the quiet house. Chapter 2. The Dog That Doesn't Bark. The next morning, Eleanor woke early, earlier than usual. The air in the house was still the same, quiet and still, but her heart had a flicker of something new. Not excitement exactly, just a soft tug of curiosity, or maybe hope. She reached for the number she had torn from the notice board and dialed. "Hello?" A gentle voice answered on the other end. "Yes, hi. I'm calling about the golden retriever, the one that doesn't bark?" "Oh, Apollo?" the woman replied with warmth. "Yes, he's still here. He's very special. Would you like to meet him?" There was a pause on Eleanor's end. "Yes, I would." The animal shelter wasn't far. Eleanor hadn't been to that part of town in years, but the moment she walked through the doors, she was struck by the sound of barking. Dozens of dogs clamoring for attention, their tails wagging wildly through the bars of their enclosures. All except one. He sat quietly at the far end, his golden fur like sunlight in a shadowed corner. Calm, watchful, still. "That's Apollo," the shelter worker said, walking beside her. "He's 3. Came to us a year ago. His previous owner abandoned him when they moved. No one ever claimed him." Eleanor walked slowly toward his enclosure. Apollo stood up as she approached, not in a frantic jumping way like the others, but with quiet, deliberate steps. His eyes were a warm honey color, deep and understanding, and he looked straight into hers as if he already knew her. She knelt down. And then the most unexpected thing happened. Apollo sat in front of her, lifted his front paws, and gently wrapped them around her shoulders. A hug. Eleanor froze. "Oh, yes." The worker chuckled softly. "He does that. He hugs people, especially when they're sad." Eleanor blinked, her throat suddenly tight. She hadn't said a word about George, about her aching loneliness, about the silence that had become her only companion. But Apollo had known. "Why doesn't he bark?" she asked, still holding on to him. The woman crouched beside her. "He was born with a rare condition. His vocal cords didn't develop properly. He's not in pain. He just doesn't make sound. Not a peep. But it doesn't mean he doesn't feel everything." Eleanor looked back at the golden eyes staring into her. "He's perfect," she whispered. The adoption papers didn't take long. The shelter staff smiled as Eleanor gently clipped the leash onto Apollo's collar. "He'll love a quiet home," they told her. "He has a gentle soul." On the way home, Apollo sat calmly in the passenger seat. He leaned in every so often and nudged Eleanor's hand with his head. And once, when they stopped at a red light, he placed a paw gently on her lap. Another hug in his own way. When they pulled into the driveway of her modest suburban home, Eleanor looked at the house differently. The silence inside didn't seem so heavy anymore. Apollo walked in and sniffed around politely. He didn't rush or knock things over. He simply explored, then curled up on the rug where George's chair used to sit. That night, as Eleanor sat reading one of George's old letters, Apollo rested his head on her feet. And for the first time in nearly a year, she didn't feel alone. She reached down, running her fingers gently through his golden fur. "No barking," she whispered. "Just hugs." Apollo thumped his tail once, slowly. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Chapter 3. The Hug That Changed Everything. The first hug outside of Eleanor's home happened just 3 days later. It was a breezy morning, and Eleanor decided to walk Apollo around the neighborhood. She hadn't strolled those sidewalks in months, maybe even a year. The world had kept turning, but she had stayed still. Until now. Apollo walked calmly beside her, his gait steady and assured. He didn't pull, didn't bark at squirrels, just kept looking up at her every few minutes, as if making sure she was still okay. They passed Mr. Beckman's house first. He was a retired accountant, always wore a pressed flannel shirt, even to collect the mail. Eleanor hadn't spoken to him in ages, not since George's funeral. He stood at the edge of his lawn, a newspaper tucked under one arm. As Eleanor passed, Apollo slowed down, then stopped. Before she could react, he walked up to Mr. Beckman, who stood stiffly, clearly unsure how to respond. And then, like a child greeting a long-lost friend, gently lifted his front paws and hugged the old man around the waist. Mr. Beckman just stood there, frozen. Then slowly, his shoulders sagged. His eyes welled up behind his bifocals. Eleanor stepped forward, worried. "I'm sorry. He just does that. No," Mr. Beckman interrupted quietly. "Don't apologize." He reached down and rested a shaky hand on Apollo's head. I haven't had anyone hug me since my wife passed, not even once." There was a long, fragile pause. "He just knew," Eleanor said softly. Mr. Beckman nodded, wiping at his eyes. "That dog, he's something special." Over the next week, it happened again and again. At the local corner store, a teenage girl crouched beside Apollo to pet him. He leaned in, rested his chin on her shoulder, and wrapped his paws around her. She blinked fast, wiped at her cheeks, and whispered, "I didn't even know I needed that." At the park, Apollo trotted up to a woman sitting alone on a bench. Her body was rigid, arms crossed, face guarded. But when Apollo hugged her, no barking, no noise, just that silent embrace. She broke down in tears. Eleanor learned her name was Linda. She had lost her sister to cancer last fall. She hadn't left her house in weeks until that day. Word began to spread. The hugging dog. People started waving at Eleanor as she walked by. A few even crossed the street just to meet Apollo. He greeted everyone the same. Gentle eyes, soft step, and then those quiet, healing hugs. The silence that once smothered Eleanor's life had been replaced with something else, something better. It hadn't been filled with noise, but with connection, with warmth. One morning, a mother and her young son stopped her on the sidewalk. The boy had trouble speaking, she explained. He was on the autism spectrum and didn't like touch. But when Apollo leaned in and hugged him, the boy didn't pull away. He laughed, a full, bubbling laugh. The mother cried, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Eleanor didn't know what to say. She simply knelt beside Apollo and hugged him too. Later that night, Eleanor sat on her porch with Apollo curled up at her feet. The sun had dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky with streaks of amber and violet. She looked down at Apollo. "You know," she said gently, "you've done more for this neighborhood in a week than I have in a decade." He thumped his tail once and looked up at her with those eyes, those old, knowing eyes that somehow seemed to carry more wisdom than most people she'd ever met. She smiled. "I think George would have liked you." Apollo rose and leaned his head into her lap. Then, of course, came the hug. Eleanor held him close, and for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Chapter 4. Echoes of George. Rain drizzled gently outside, tracing slow lines down the kitchen window. Eleanor stood at the counter, drying a cup that once belonged to George. His favorite, the one with the faded army emblem, the one he refused to replace, even when the handle chipped. Apollo sat nearby, his head tilted slightly, watching her with soft curiosity. The quietness of the house was no longer painful. It was reflective, filled with echoes, not emptiness, like how music lingers in a room long after the last note fades. That morning, Eleanor had opened the old cedar chest in the bedroom. She hadn't touched it in nearly a year. Inside were keepsakes from decades together, photo albums, George's military patches, a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet. And then she found something she didn't expect, a letter. Unopened. The handwriting was unmistakable. George's, strong and precise, but with a slight shake toward the end. The postmark was from just 2 weeks before he passed. Somehow she had missed it. Her hands trembled as she sat down beside Apollo and peeled open the envelope. "My Ellie, I knew I wouldn't get much more time. I could feel it. but I needed to write you one last time, not to say goodbye, but to remind you of the promise we made long ago. Remember that time we were sitting on the porch, talking about what life might look like without one of us? You cried? I didn't. I should have. You told me you didn't think you could go on. I told you that if anything ever happened to me, I wanted you to find a reason to smile again. Ellie, if you're reading this, I hope you've done that. I hope the house isn't too quiet. I hope you still open the windows in the morning like you used to. I hope there's someone or something that keeps your heart from hardening. And if there's not, please go find it. You don't have to forget me to keep living. You just have to forgive the world for moving on. All my love, always yours, George. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, the edges of the paper softening beneath her tears. She didn't cry in great heaving sobs. It was quieter than that, softer, like letting go. Apollo moved beside her, not with urgency, but with purpose. He leaned into her lap and gently wrapped his front legs around her waist. Another hug, a silent, perfect hug. Eleanor let the letter fall to her side. She buried her face into Apollo's golden fur, breathing in the comfort of him, the warmth. I miss him so much, she whispered. Apollo didn't move. He just held her, the way George used to. She didn't know how Apollo understood so much, but in that moment, it didn't matter, because for the first time since the funeral, she let herself truly mourn. Not just the man she lost, but the years they wouldn't have, the dinners left uneaten, the stories untold. And when the tears stopped, she felt lighter, not because the grief was gone, but because it no longer had her in chains. That weekend, Eleanor placed the letter into a small wooden frame and hung it by the front door. A reminder of George's final gift, permission to live again. Later, as she and Apollo walked through the neighborhood, a little girl with Down syndrome came running up, arms outstretched. Apollo met her halfway, hugging her so gently it made Eleanor's heart ache. The girl's mother wiped her eyes and mouthed, "Thank you," to Eleanor. Eleanor just nodded, her smile wet with emotion. These moments, these quiet, beautiful moments, were George's echoes, and she was finally listening. Chapter 5. Healing on the Porch. The porch hadn't seen company in years. After George passed, Eleanor stopped sitting there. It used to be their spot. He'd read the paper. She'd sip her tea. Sometimes they'd just watch the wind rustle through the trees, saying nothing at all. That kind of quiet was beautiful. Shared quiet. But the silence after he left had felt hollow, unbearable, until Apollo. Now the porch was becoming alive again. It started one Sunday afternoon. Eleanor was reading on the swing with Apollo curled beside her, his chin resting on her slippered foot. A breeze stirred the chimes George had hung up the summer before he got sick. The notes fluttered like whispers. Across the street, Mr. Beckman was trimming his hedges. Linda, the woman from the park bench, walked slowly past with a casserole dish in her arms. Eleanor stood, surprising even herself. "Linda," she called out. The woman turned, cautious at first, but her face softened. "Hi. Do you have a minute?" Eleanor gestured to the porch. "You could sit a while." Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She climbed the steps, placing the dish carefully on the wicker table. "Smells like tuna?" Eleanor smiled. "With crushed potato chips on top. My sister's recipe. I made too much." Eleanor didn't press the subtext. Grief often made too much of everything. Too much quiet, too much time, too much sadness. They sat for an hour, sharing stories, the casserole dish between them like an unspoken truce. Apollo hugged Linda, of course. Twice. When Linda finally left, she touched Eleanor's arm. "Thank you. This meant something." The next day, Eleanor baked cookies. She placed a little sign on the edge of her porch. "Free cookies. Sit a while if you'd like." She didn't expect much, but by noon, a retired school teacher named Marlene stopped by. Then a teenager named Travis, who usually wore headphones so big they looked like earmuffs. Then 2 dads walking a baby in a stroller. And of course, Apollo hugged every single one of them. Each visit brought a different story. Marlene had lost her sister in the spring and didn't know how to grieve after a lifetime of telling others to stay strong. Travis confessed he had anxiety, said he didn't know why, but when Apollo hugged him, he didn't feel so afraid. Even the dads shared how hard parenting had been lately. They laughed about how Apollo seemed to know exactly who needed comfort most. Eleanor listened. She offered more cookies than advice. Apollo did the rest. By the end of the week, the porch had become a sanctuary. Neighbors who used to walk past with polite nods now lingered. They brought stories, leftovers, questions. Some even brought folding chairs. Eleanor found herself laughing again. Not forced laughter, the real kind that sneaks up on you and makes your eyes crinkle. She pulled out George's old thermos and served lemonade in paper cups, played Ella Fitzgerald on a little Bluetooth speaker her daughter had mailed her last Christmas. The porch began to sound like joy again. At one point, someone jokingly asked if Apollo was a trained therapy dog. "No," Eleanor said with a soft smile. "I think he just understands what pain looks like." That night, after the last chair was folded and the last crumb was swept, Eleanor sat alone on the porch with Apollo by her side. The stars above blinked like they were trying to remember a song. She looked down at him. "You're helping people heal, you know that?" Apollo wagged his tail slowly, then rested his head on her lap. No barking, no tricks, just presence. And in that stillness, Eleanor understood something. Healing wasn't always loud. It wasn't always wrapped in big gestures or long speeches. Sometimes it was a porch swing, a warm cookie, and a silent dog who gave the kind of hugs the world forgot it needed. Chapter 6. The Block Party. It started as a passing thought, something Eleanor murmured one evening as Apollo laid beside her on the porch. "You know, George would have loved all this. The laughter, the stories, the neighbors." She reached down and scratched behind Apollo's ear. "Maybe it's time we brought everyone together, just like he used to do every 4th of July. Apollo responded with a familiar soft tail wag, then rested his head gently against her leg. The next morning, she made a plan. Not a big event, not some fancy production, just a simple block party, something warm and real, the kind that wasn't about decorations or noise, but about people, healing people. She handwrote notes and slipped them into mailboxes. "You're invited to an old-fashioned neighborhood gathering in memory of George Hall. For stories, smiles, and maybe a hug or two, Apollo insists. Saturday, 4 p.m., bring whatever makes you feel at home." When Saturday arrived, Eleanor woke up early, butterflies dancing in her chest. She baked 2 trays of George's favorite oatmeal cookies, played his old Motown records, and laid out folding chairs in the front yard. She even pinned George's Army medal to her cardigan, a quiet tribute. And then, they came. First, Mr. Beckman with a bowl of coleslaw and his stiff, polite smile that gradually softened. Then Linda, clutching a tray of lemon bars. Marlene arrived with a thermos of sweet tea. Families came. Some Eleanor hadn't even met before. Kids ran in the grass. Teens shyly helped set up tables. Neighbors who had never said more than hello began sharing stories as if they'd known each other for years. And Apollo? He was everywhere. He moved gently from person to person, reading the room like a seasoned host. Some got a simple nuzzle, others the full embrace. Every hug he gave was met with something real: laughter, tears, or long exhales that sounded like letting go. Even the grumpy man from 2 blocks down, Mr. Halberd, who hadn't smiled since his wife passed 3 years ago, knelt down and let Apollo wrap his paws around his shoulders. The man's eyes filled with tears, and he whispered, "Thank you, boy." I didn't know I still had feelings left. Eleanor stood nearby, watching it unfold, the healing, the connection. It was like watching roots slowly stretch across soil and find each other again. As the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, a hush fell over the gathering. Mr. Beckman, surprisingly, cleared his throat and raised a small glass of lemonade. I don't speak at things," he began awkwardly, "but I think we all feel something special today." He looked at Eleanor. "It's been hard for many of us. Loss, loneliness, silence. But somehow, through this dog, this quiet dog who doesn't make a sound, we've all started hearing again." He paused. George would have been proud. Eleanor felt her chest ache in the best way. She reached down and touched the metal on her sweater. Someone behind her began to clap, then another, and then everyone. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, it was soft, like a heartbeat. Apollo stood in the center, ears slightly back, tail wagging gently. Then, without prompting, he moved to Eleanor's side and leaned into her leg. A hug. Later that night, after the folding chairs were stacked and the last paper plate tossed, Eleanor sat on the porch again. The moon was high, bathing the street in silver light. She ran her hand through Apollo's fur, then looked up. "Thank you, George," she whispered, "for teaching me how to love a quiet life, and for sending me someone to share it with." Apollo nudged her hand, then gently climbed into her lap. Not all the way, just enough to give her the same hug he gave everyone else. Eleanor laughed through a tear. All right, one more." And under the stars, in the warm hush of a healing neighborhood, they sat together, 2 souls who didn't need words to understand what love truly meant. Chapter 7. Peace Found in a Silent Hug. The seasons turned quietly that year. The leaves blushed red and gold, and Eleanor found herself smiling more than she had in a long time. The once lonely porch was now a daily gathering place. Apollo had become a neighborhood legend, the hugging dog, known not just for his unusual silence, but for how deeply he seemed to understand people. Eleanor didn't need to explain him anymore. People just felt it. And they came. But it wasn't just about Apollo. It was about what he had unlocked in others. The quiet veteran widow who began tutoring children again. The single father who now hosted backyard movie nights. Even Mr. Beckman had started bringing Eleanor coffee every Tuesday morning. He never stayed long, but his presence was his way of saying thank you. Eleanor felt something shift inside her. It wasn't that the grief was gone. It never would be. But it no longer defined her. It lived beside her. Gently, softened by the laughter of others, by the cookies passed over fences, by the simple joy of having someone to sit beside on a quiet afternoon. One crisp Sunday morning, Eleanor bundled herself in George's old jacket, tucked a folded letter into her pocket, and clipped Apollo's leash. They walked together to the cemetery, just a few blocks away. The leaves crunched underfoot, and Apollo's tail swayed with a slow, steady rhythm. When they reached George's grave, Eleanor knelt down. The headstone was simple, like the man himself. George Hall, beloved husband, soldier, storyteller. "You don't have to forget me to keep living." She placed the letter on the stone. "Hey, love," she whispered. "I brought someone I think you'd want to meet." Apollo stepped forward quietly. No bark, no sound, just presence. He stood beside Eleanor, then did what he always did best. He leaned into her and hugged. Eleanor rested her head against his, eyes closed, letting the wind carry the moment. "I kept the promise," she whispered. "I'm living. I'm loving again. And I've found peace, George. Real peace." She reached up and touched the medal still pinned to her jacket. The same one she wore on the day of the block party. The same one George once tucked into his shirt before every deployment. Apollo stayed still, his warmth anchoring her to the ground. His silence said more than words ever could. That night, Eleanor slept deeply for the first time in over a year. No restless turning, no waking in the middle of the night to stare at the empty pillow beside her. Just sleep, deep and kind. Apollo curled up at the foot of her bed, his soft breath like ocean waves against the silence. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the porch chimes whispered again. He never barked, not even once. But in a world filled with noise, this silent golden retriever gave the loudest kind of love, a hug. He didn't just comfort a grieving widow. He brought a forgotten neighborhood back to life. And in doing so, he reminded us all that healing doesn't need words. So if this story touched you, if you've ever felt the weight of silence, or found hope in the most unexpected companion, watch the full story. Let Apollo show you what love sounds like when it says absolutely nothing at all.